Welcome to the 2025 K-State Garden Hour webinar series. We are so glad that you're here. This webinar series started in 2020 and has been a collaboration of the entire K-State Horticulture Extension team. And since the start of this program, we've reached over 107,185 gardeners just like you. We're pleased to continue offering the K-State Garden Hour series for free. If you've enjoyed these educational webinars, please consider making a tax-deductible donation to support this program. The link to donate can be found in the chat or on our K-State Garden Hour website. This webinar is hosted by K-State Research and Extension. My name is Laura Phillips, and I am the Horticulture Extension Agent for the Meadowlark District. Everyone involved in the development of this series is an extension professional for K-State. Most of us have a background in horticultural education or related discipline, but most of all, we each have a love for educating and sharing important gardening topics. Now, before we get started, we do have a couple housekeeping notes to cover. Please use the Q&A feature for questions related to the presentation. This is where we will look for questions at the end of the webinar during the Q&A session. You should see a button along the bottom tab of your Zoom window that says Q&A. If you click on that, you will be able to enter your question. Today's webinar will be recorded and we'll post it to our K-State Garden Hour website. We typically upload additional resources related to each topic as well. If we share links through the chat, we'll also upload them to the website. Our website is also where you will have access to previous topics and upcoming topics in the series. Our moderators today are Annie Baker and Sharon Ashworth, and they will share information through the chat during the presentation. They will also help us facilitate the Q&A portion of the webinar. Today's topic is climate resilient gardens, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Pam Paulsen. Please give us a few minutes while we transition and share the presentation slides.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, let me get this up and going here. Okay. Well, I know all of us as gardeners, as we're outside and we notice the changes in the climate. I know I've looked at plants that take the heat a little bit more. I also know that I've got 20 pepper plants right now in November that are still loaded with fruit. So yeah, those of us that spend time in our gardens, we notice the changes that have been coming. So we'll talk a little bit about just what is climate and some of the changes we're seeing, and then talk about what we can do in our gardens to kind of help work through those climate changes. So climate is not weather. It takes into account the weather, but weather is, you know, what you look at and see outside your window right here, right now. I can see the trees are blowing in the wind and it's a nice blue sunny sky. So weather is short term. It's the current state of the atmosphere in a certain time and place. It can change, you know, we know here in Kansas, it can change minute to minute. And like it says here, it helps us to know what to wear when we walk outside the door. Climate is more long-term, so it takes into account the averages of the weather that we see over time, and then it can refer to a certain place, but it also takes into account the climate throughout the whole world. This is where we get our hardiness zones, our frost-free dates are all based on climate data. Both weather and climate take into account temperatures, rainfall, whether it's sunny or cloudy, whether it's humid or even just the air pressure. So climate change, what we're seeing over those changes in the climate over time, is scientists define climate change as the long-term shift in global temperatures and regional weather patterns. So we've heard of global warming. Well, it's not just warming, it's changes in everything climate related. So rainfall, cold temperatures, even severe weather. So over time, I mean, even longer than it's actually been recorded, scientists have been able to look at what's happened in climate by looking at tree rings of ancient trees and such. But so we have had fluctuations and we've had warming periods and cooling periods throughout time. But what we've been seeing in about the last 100 years are those fluctuations have increased a great deal over what it had been in the past. And, with our natural fluctuations, plants and animals have had time to adapt. But now we're seeing those fluctuations 2, 3, 4 times accelerated over what's in the past or what's happened in the past. And so plants and animals don't have that time to adapt to those fluctuations. And so what's causing this is just an increase in greenhouse gases such as methane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, but even just water, natural water vapor. So we're seeing in the last 100 years an increase in those greenhouse gases. So what happens is the sun radiates heat, it comes and heats the earth. Some of that heat gets radiated back out into the atmosphere, and some of it gets trapped here, here in our own environment. Well, as those greenhouse gases have increased, more heat is staying in our atmosphere surrounding the earth and heating up more. We need some of that to keep some of the heat in. If we didn't have some of those greenhouse gases, it would be freezing temperatures on Earth year round. But with too much of those greenhouse gases, that heat is not escaping and we're seeing warming temperatures. And so they act just like a greenhouse. The thicker the glass is, the more it holds in that heat at the surface. So the changes that have been seen over the past 100 or so years is the surface temperature of the Earth. They've been noticing that it's heating about 0.11 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. So over the last 100 years or so, they've seen an increase in the average temperatures of about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And 2 degrees over 100 years doesn't seem like a long time, but then if you look at the whole history of the Earth in millions of years and take that into consideration, 100 years is just a blip. So from the last 10 years or so, we've seen the hottest summers ever recorded in actual climate data recordings. Even the USDA cold hardiness zones have shifted. They usually go on 30-degree or 30-year time frames, and they've shifted twice now in the last 30 years. Degrees Fahrenheit over the last 100 years, and even our growing seasons have extended. I know this year it was warm in February, so I threw out lettuce and spinach seeds in the middle of February, and they sprouted and grew. Like I said, I still have peppers that are blooming right now because the temperatures have been so warm. Here are just showing the average temperature increase over the last few hundred years. And if you look up until about 100 years ago, it's been pretty steady. And these temperature increases are totally follow that graph from showing the increase of the greenhouse gases. And these are the hardiness zones. So 1990, Kansas was zone 5 and zone 6, and now we're pretty much completely zone 6, with even some zone 7 now in Kansas. So this was the map of just Kansas in 2005, and you can see those northern counties were all pretty much zone 5, where now we just have a few blips that are zone 5, and then the southeastern part of the state is now in zone 7. So that's saying that at one time, our average extreme minimum temperatures in the wintertime were -10 to -5, and now we're not even getting below 0 for the average of our extreme temperatures. And these are just showing where it's projected now. Climatologists can look at historic data and look at conditions and kind of model what they expect for the future. And again, this temperature data follows those greenhouse gases as they increase. Our temperatures are predicted to increase over time. And it's not just temperature, but like I said, it's all parts of weather. So we're looking at more extreme rain events as well. Here, this bottom graph shows the number of days where we get 2 or more inches of rain in one event in a day. And you can see that those have been increasing over the years. This top graph is what to me is most alarming. Looking up until our current time, this shows days per year with minimum temperatures above 90 degrees, meaning we don't cool down at all below 90 degrees. And we've had, a day or two in the past few years, but as we look at this graph in the next 40, 50 years, we're going to start having more and more days where our nights don't even cool down below 90 degrees. And that's that's hard on people and that's very hard on plants. These are just some of our rainfall events that we've had this year. We've been in a drought and an extreme drought for the past few years. And here in Hutchinson, we hear a lot about Cheney Lake, that the levels there have been low. So these rainfalls have been really great for bringing up lake levels for Cheney Lake, but a lake, can handle 7 inches of rain in a day. A basement can't, our plants can't. So we're seeing, these rainfall events. Yes, it's taken us out of the drought, but we've also seen flooding issues because we get this rain all at one time instead of spread out over time. And here's just another one that we just had in September. Again, those 7 inches of rain in 24 hours is more than people and plants can handle. But however, when you look at projections, we're still expected to be in a drought in the future. So we may be getting large rainfall events, but it's not enough to sustain the rainfall that we need. So what can we expect in the future? So again, more extreme weather patterns. So we'll see warmer summers, more intense winter storms, longer, deeper droughts, and more flooding, as well as increase in severe weather. So for us, tornado, wind, and hailstorms. And because we'll be, in droughts and we'll have plants that are under stress and suffering, we'll see longer and hotter burning wildflowers. When I first moved here to Reno County, I don't recall having grass fires, to the extent that we've had them in the past few years. So our warmer summers mean warmer nights, those 90-degree nights. And we've gotten a few of those where it's 10 o'clock at night and it's still, 95 degrees. I can't imagine, in the future waking up at 5, 6 in the morning and it's still 90 degrees. And that's very stressful on our plants. We've seen that in the past few years. Our trees have really struggled. A lot of our plants are adapted to take heat and sunlight during the day, but they need those cooler temperatures at night to recover, and they're just not getting those. So we're seeing a lot of increased heat stress. So, plants will tend to wilt when it gets too hot and they're not able to take up enough water. So they're not losing water because that wilting helps conserve water within the plant, but those leaves still, it doesn't keep the temperature down in those leaves. So we're seeing a lot of leaf scorch. And then as temperatures creep up, plant growth, when we're about mid-80s, we get great plant growth, but then plants start to slow down when we get up into the 90s and 100 degrees. The photosynthesis slows down, so they're not producing as much food as they need through photosynthesis and warmer temperatures, but they're still respiring. So those carbohydrates that they're producing as food and energy are still getting used. So in hotter temperatures, they aren't creating as much food as they use. And so then plants kind of get this depletion of resources, and then they kind of just die a slow death as they starve to death. And we've been seeing that a lot in our trees lately. Over the past 2-3 years, we've had some extreme temperatures and it's been very dry, and those trees can hang on for a while, but as they slowly deplete their reserves, then they suffer from it. Warmer temperatures, especially at night, also increase the chances for disease issues. You know, we tend to see brown patch in our lawns when our nights reach 70 degrees, and that will just proliferate with those warmer temperatures. With the increased stress in our plants, they aren't as enabled to withstand those disease pressures, and as those temperatures go up, those diseases increase as well. So we'll see more drought, and pollination stops or decreases as we get into the 90s and 100 degrees as well. So if you're starting to see some of your vegetables look like this is just samples of poor pollination in our vegetable plants. So tomatoes, when we get up into the upper 90s, they'll either abort the flowers, or the pollen doesn't get produced, or those pollen tubes that move the pollen throughout the plant get closed up, and our plants just don't function as well in those hotter temperatures. We'll also see milder winters. So those plants, especially our fruit trees that need a certain number of cold temperatures, they won't be getting those what we call chilling hours. So they won't be getting as many chilling hours in order to fruit. They also, as with warmer temperatures, plants don't get that deep dormancy that they need to rest. And again, so then they're using up more reserves than they're creating. So longer growing seasons with earlier bloom times and later flowering, and delayed leaf drops. I'm looking at the trees out my window right now, and they're still full and green. And I know this weekend we're supposed to get down into the 20s. And so plants aren't getting a chance to harden off as we're staying warm, and then we get those quick temperature drops, and that can cause stress or even plant death if they're not hardened off enough. So plants are more susceptible to winter kill because they aren't hardened off. We're seeing more and more tree bark injury as that sap starts flowing in those tree trunks, and then we get a quick freeze and that sap expands, and then we see injuries to the tree trunks. We're seeing more pests from southern climates moving in because our winters are more mild, and so they're able to withstand those winters. And when we're not freezing and the soils are wet, we get prolonged saturated soils. So some of those plants that are more sensitive to moisture, we're having a harder time growing. And then we're also seeing more soil diseases because those soils are staying wet instead of freezing. Now, it's not all bad. This is allowing us to grow a few plants that we may not have been able to grow in colder temperatures. So we're also seeing other changes within the ecosystem. You know, many of our plants will mature and bloom based on either temperature or day length. Many of them are by day length, meaning how long of the sun is shining during the day will trigger blooming. But many of our insects come out of dormancy based on temperature. And so our pollinators that pollinated certain plants are not in sync anymore. With warmer temperatures, we're also seeing an increase in invasive plants. A month ago, I was in Missouri, and we're probably about at the same level as where Wichita is. And there was just kudzu covering, you couldn't even see the trees along the roadside because it was just covered in kudzu vines. We're seeing changes in bird and animal migration patterns, and our soils are getting altered as well by our changing ecosystem. So they're getting drier. Our soils and the plants in our soils are great for holding that carbon dioxide and keeping it out of the atmosphere. But as those soils happen, like what's in this picture in the background, as they crack and open up, that carbon is being released into the atmosphere. So that's also changing the soil structure and the nutrient availability. We're seeing increased erosion from those, those big rain events and wind erosion as well. And all of that is changing the activity of those beneficial microbes in the soil. But all is not lost. There are many things that gardeners can do to both help combat this climate change as well as make their gardens able to withstand our changing climate. So we want to protect and improve the soils. We want to use our fertilizer wisely. We also want to water wisely, creating habitats for those beneficial insects that help our plants grow, as well as prepare for some pests that we may not have seen before. But the best thing we can do for our atmosphere and our environment is to just do what gardeners do and grow our plants. So soil improvement, first and foremost, always get a soil test before you apply anything to your soil, especially if you haven't had a soil test in an area for 4 or 5 years. It doesn't hurt to get one and to notice if anything has changed. And what that does is that helps you limit synthetic fertilizer use. The production of synthetic fertilizers contributes greatly to greenhouse gases. So if you can limit synthetic fertilizer use by applying only what a soil test tells you you need, or even working in organic sources of fertilizer, such as compost and manure. Limit tilling the soil. Yeah, till it to work in those amendments that you need, but don't till it just because it's the start of the season and it's time to till, or if you've got weeds, if you can pull those weeds instead of disrupting the soil, is the best way to go. Tilling the soil, again, breaks up that soil structure, but again, it releases a lot of the carbon that's held in the soil into the atmosphere. But it also breaks up all of those microbial networks that those microorganisms in the soil form. So then they have to start all over, and it sets them back as well. Adding organic matter is a great way to improve the soil, either compost or mulch. Organic matter is what those beneficial microbes feed off of. By doing that, they release nutrients to our plants, and that they also help improve the soil structure. So soil is able, whether you've got loose sandy soil or heavy clay soil, it loosens up heavy clay. It helps sandy soil hold on to nutrients and water better. And again, those microorganisms just have a better environment to live in. So cover crops are another great way to add organic matter to the soil. But cover crops also help you to keep something living in the soil year round. So that's important for, again, those microorganisms. It's helpful for keeping that soil structure intact as well. If you can include legumes, that adds some nitrogen to the soil, so you're not having to apply additional nitrogen. Clover is another legume. Grains like blue stem or even buckwheat and such have a nice network of roots that, as they break down, they add organic matter to the soil. Deeper rooted plants can bring nutrients up and moisture up to levels where more shallow rooted plants are growing as well. For stormwater management, again, we're seeing more of those big rain events, and then more time in between those rain events where we suffer those droughts. So conserving water and managing stormwater is becoming more and more important. So if you can reduce flood risk by limiting concrete, so replace hard surfaces with grass and plants. And if you can do a mixture of plants over grass is better, but grass is better than just concrete surfaces as well. There's also permeable paving that's got a little more pore space so that moisture can soak through if you do have to have concrete surfaces, or if you can do stones or pavers or pebbles or gravel instead of just a solid concrete surface. Bioswales are great for helping direct runoff from either a sloping area or from downspouts, or if you've got downspouts where water is running off, if you can direct that to a rain garden or even attach some hose to it or extenders so it goes to a garden area so it's not running off, to channel that stormwater. Otherwise, raised beds are a great way to deal with flooding areas and saturated soils. So this is just a real quick rain garden. When you're selecting plants for your rain garden, you want to look at plants that can take both dry and wet, because when we get those rain events, that water is going to sit in that area where those plants are growing. But then when we're not getting rain, it's going to be a little bit drier. So you want plants that are pretty flexible in their growing conditions. And so you want like a sloped area or a low area to put your rain garden in. And you want it, where, like in this picture, water from your downspout will run into, or if there's just an area where water moves through your property, and you want to create your rain garden where that water can settle. And then you don't want rain gardens to be very deep, so 4 to 8 inches deep. If you can put some gravel or some sand at the bottom of that to help with a little bit of drainage, and then plant your plants just above that. There's also, just water efficiency. So we're conserving the water that we do have, and one of the best ways is just to monitor your plants on a regular basis. Instead of setting your irrigation to go off, every other day for 2 hours, just water when it's needed rather than, on a schedule. So that involves monitoring and checking your plants regularly. Our container plants and newly planted plants are the ones that are going to need a little more water than established plants. By not watering on a schedule and watering only when it needs it also toughens up your plants a little bit. If they're getting water on a regular basis on a schedule, those roots aren't going to go nice and deep and grow strong roots. We tend to get a little bit weaker root system and more shallow root system. And so then when we do get the hotter days, those plants aren't quite as resilient. So watering in the morning helps with, keeping down evaporation, as does drip irrigation. Drip irrigation also puts that water more where you want it than in areas where weeds and other things can grow. But there's also other options. This picture on the right are clay pot oyas. You can make your own, like is shown on the picture there, or you can purchase them. These are just untreated, unglazed clay pots, and you plant them in the ground next to your plants and fill them with water. In this bottom picture here, you can see where this clay pot was and how the roots just totally surround it. So this is one of the most efficient ways that you can water some of your plants. Stormwater collection through rain barrels is another way. Mulching keeps that moisture from fluctuating so much in the soil. And then water to establish your plants is the most important thing to do. And then again, water is needed once they are established. Here's one of the oyas. Again, you can make your own with just some unglazed clay pots. So 10 times more efficient than surface irrigation and can save up to 70% of water use in your garden. And the way these work is you fill them with water. As the soil dries out, it pulls the water out of those oyas to your plants. But if that soil is moist and has water in it, it does not pull the water out of those clay pots. Rain barrels are also a great way to make use of water that otherwise would just run off the roof. 1-inch rainstorm can produce more than 700 gallons of storm water from a typical roof. And so we should be collecting that and using that for our gardens rather than just running off the roof, down the driveway, and into the road. These are a great way to work with oyas. You can run a hose from your rain barrel and put some emitters so that they automatically fill up your oyas as well. So when we're watering the lawn, our lawns are probably what take the most water of our properties. Don't start watering too early in the spring. You want to condition your lawns to withstand some drought. I've got a neighbor here that they turn on their sprinklers in March and they're still running every day right now. And that continuous water, again, keeps those grass roots shallow and at the surface. So when we do get hot temperatures and a hot windy day, those plants aren't as resilient. So it's best to only water when the grass needs it. Water deeply and infrequently, because that will get the roots strong and deep. Water early in the morning, again, to help with evaporation. And water only the lawn, not the sidewalk, to avoid creating runoff. So pay attention to your grass. When it starts turning a bluish gray color, or if you walk across it and it doesn't spring up right away, it leaves the footprint in there. That's when it's needing some water. And here's just an example. If you walk across it and that impression from your footprint stays, then those grass blades don't, or those grass plants don't have enough water to spring back up. That's when it needs to be watered. So watering deeply and infrequently, if you can water deep and then let some air in, let them dry out in between and let some oxygen in there, that creates good, strong, healthy, and deep-rooted plants rather than shallow, regular watering. If you've got, heavy clay soils, you might need to cycle through your sprinkler system. So instead of watering for a half hour and that clay is just too tight to soak it all up at once, you water for 15 minutes and run through the whole cycle if you've got lawn irrigation, and then come back around and do it again for 15 minutes. So it still gets that 30 minutes of irrigation, but that water goes down into the soil instead of running off a heavy clay soil. But what we found is most of our lawns need about 1 inch of water per week. That usually, typical soil will soak down a good 6 to 8 inches is about the depth that we need for our lawn grasses. So measure, a tuna can is a great way to measure how much water you're putting out. And so then you can know how long to run your sprinklers to get that 1 inch. Yeah, and that'll vary again depending on your soil type, or if it's the middle of August and we're getting those 40-mile-an-hour winds, you may need to put a little bit more on. But again, that's part of that monitoring your plants, monitoring your lawn to see when it needs it. There's also smart irrigation technology, and this is a great way to monitor environmental conditions and when your plants are needing water. So there's very complicated ones, and then there's very simple ones. There's just rain sensors that you can put up on your gutter, and when they've got water in it, it cuts off the power to your sprinkler so it does not run. And then when it's dry, then the water will come back on. There's also ones that will monitor humidity and amount of transpiration in the plants and be much more exacting. But a rain sensor is a great way to control the water with your lawn sprinklers. And then you also want to monitor what your sprinklers are doing. So you want to keep that water on the plants on the lawn, and not, what they're doing here on the right. If you can see all that water collecting in the driveway and just running down the driveway into the street. And again, monitor to make sure that they're all functioning properly. For vegetables, it's important to know when our vegetables, as well as our flowers and other, trees and shrubs, when they need water the most. For our vegetables, when they're flowering, when they're putting on fruit, and that fruit is growing, is the most stressful time and the most resource needed time for our vegetable plants. So that is when you want to be very consistent with your watering. When they're seeding and they're establishing roots, they need consistent water then too, but because the plants are small, they usually don't need as much water at that time. You also want to know the growth habits of your plants. So if you've got shallow rooted plants, and here I've got vegetables, but that goes for any of our ornamentals as well. If you've got shallow rooted plants, then you probably don't need to do that 30 minutes of watering at a time. Where if you've got deeper rooted plants, yes, you'll want to run your irrigation just a little bit longer for those. Now, creating habitat for beneficial insects is also important to create a resilient garden. So why is it important to attract insects to the garden? Most of our insects are not pests, but most of them are a benefit to our plants. So we've got insects that will decompose plant material and animal waste. So they're great at recycling nutrients and giving nutrients back to our plants. By doing that, they improve our soils. We also have pollinators that help our plants to produce seeds and fruit. Um, a lot of our insects prey on other insects, so we do have insect pests, but attracting beneficial insects that are predators, parasitoids, will help reduce pest populations as well. And then those insects also help with the whole ecosystem. You know, they provide food for wildlife. Many of the birds and other animals feed off of insects too. So there are beneficial insect-friendly practices that you can use in your garden. You know, one is to know who the good insects are. So don't, you know, I do get people that call and just say they saw a bug in their tree and want to know how to control it. Most of those insects don't need to be controlled. They're actually benefiting us and not causing harm to our plants. So insects will need food and water sources. So they need flowers for nectar. That's their carbohydrate source. And then pollen is their protein source. Many of these that are predators of other insects, you know, planting flowers will not only give those beneficial insects that nectar and pollen, but it'll attract other insects that they feed off of. We also want to provide nesting and overwintering sites. You know, this keeps those insects from just being a short-time visitor to get some pollen, but they actually end up living and reproducing in our gardens. Limit insecticide use or use very target-specific pesticides. You know, one of our more common ones is dipel or the Bacillus thuringiensis that only gets caterpillars. It won't harm any bees or beetles or anything else. You know, and don't use the bug zappers. The bug zappers are indiscriminate on what they control. But the best thing is to have some tolerance for plant damage. Yes, some of these insects will feed off of leaves and flowers, but usually, you know, they don't do so much harm that it justifies eliminating them. You know, otherwise, you know, plant some extras. So I always plant dill and fennel for me, but I always plant plenty for the swallowtails, the swallowtail caterpillars as well. But it's also important to know which insects you're dealing with, you know, so know which ones are the bad ones, learn which is being caused by any damage that's being caused by pests or diseases. You know, again, not all insects are bad. So again, go back to your monitoring your garden and scout for pests frequently. The sooner you can get on a pest problem, the less that you'll have to do to control them. So when it does come to control, you know, use the least toxic control methods first, you know, cultural and mechanical, meaning, you know, stomp them with your foot or squish them before resulting to using insecticides. Because most of those insecticides not only kill the bad insects, but they often hurt our good insects as well. So again, most plants can sustain some damage. It's usually us that don't tolerate the damage as well as the plants do. So learn to tolerate some damage and put up with that. So, and then again, learn to recognize the damage from diseases and abiotic problems like that leaf scorch or wind damage, because controlling insects won't affect that. So our pollinators, these are the ones that we usually think of for our beneficial insects. They're the ones that move pollen from one part of the plant to another while they're looking for nectar. And it's usually honeybees that we think of, but there's so many other pollinators out there besides just honeybees. Flies, hoverflies, beetles, moths, butterflies, solitary bees. Most of our native bees are solitary bees as well as bumblebees. So we want to create habitat for all of these. So when we're looking at planting for our pollinators, you know, most of them are attracted to bright colors and patterns. They need nectar as well. So and aromas, they're attracted to the scent of the flowers besides just the color. White, blue, and yellow are the colors most attracted to most of our insects. The other is how available is that pollen to the insect. You know, when we think of a bee and you can hear it buzzing, that vibration is what loosens that pollen from the plant. Um, Different flowers produce different types of pollen, so some have higher protein content than others. So some of those are more attractive to our insects as well. If they've got nectar in them, then that's even more attractive. But if we look at some of the flowers, they're breeding a lot more of them now for attractiveness, and it's at the expense of nectar and pollen. So if you look at like a flower that's got a landing site for butterflies, if they're nice and broad, if they're too deep, many of our insects can't get to the pollen. So if those nectar tubes are greater than 2 millimeters, then often the insects can't even get to that pollen or that nectar. So when we're planting for insects, most of our plants that are flowering need a good 6 to 8 hours of full sun. But if you can put them in areas where they're a little bit protected from the wind, then that protects the insects as well. Plant diversity, the more of a variety that you can plant, the more of a variety of insects that you will attract. But you also want to look at bloom time. So you want to have blooms throughout the whole growing season. And then choosing older heirloom varieties, single flowers, and natives, those are the ones that are going to have more nectar and more pollen. Your habitat size and shape, of course, larger the better. But grow what you can where you can is the best thing to do. And then planting those flowers where they're clustered together. Butterflies don't have great eyesight, so they're going to see a giant patch of zinnias or a giant patch of asters over just one flower here or there. So the more that you can plant larger clumps of flowers together, the better they'll be seen. But also, as our insects, especially our bees, they tend to stick with one species when they're out pollinating at a time. They may come, another day go to a different flower, but many of them stick with one flower. So if you can plant in clusters, that's what's called flower fidelity, where they stay with one species at a time when they're out pollinating. We also want to create overwintering sites. So this kind of contradicts, putting mulch down and protecting the soil. You also do want to leave some open areas because many of our solitary bees are ground nesting. So leave some open areas for those insects so they can build their nests in the soil. This time of year, a lot of our insects are getting ready to overwinter in our plant stems. And so don't be in too much of a hurry to clean up your garden as well. So leave plants out there for the winter time where they're overwintering, and even in the springtime many of these insects won't emerge until we're mid-50s or so. So again, don't be in too big of a hurry in the springtime to remove some of that plant debris. I use this as a way to be lazy instead of having to clean up my garden. I'm saving that mess for the insects. So native plants and beneficial insects, they've kind of evolved together. So native plants support native insects, which supports our birds and our other wildlife. Many of our insects are specialists, and they have specific relationships with specific plants. Here in the pictures are examples of the monarch butterflies, where their larvae will only feed off of plants in the milkweed family. So no two plant species have the same leaf chemistry, and insects have evolved to have those specific relationships with specific plant material. So other benefits of our native plants besides supporting our insects, because those native plants have adapted and evolved to our local growing conditions, they usually need fewer inputs. So they are used to what is in our soil, so they tend not to need more fertilizers. They've adapted to the local pests, the native pests as well. So fewer inputs as far as pesticides or fertilizing. And they don't need to be mowed every Saturday morning, or they don't need to be watered on a regular basis. Most of our native plants tend to have very deep roots, so they can withstand our heat and our drought, especially in Kansas. They tend to be less time intensive. They're not maintenance free, but they're much lower maintenance than like having a lawn where here it says, you know, the average homeowner spends 40 hours a year just mowing the lawn. And so in that aspect, they tend to be less costly. You know, initial cost is probably a little bit higher, but then over time, they tend to be less costly. Yeah, this is a case study from up in Nebraska. Public library converted 2.5 acres of bluegrass, turfgrass to native buffalo grass into mixed prairie plantings. That resulted in a reduction of 1.5 million gallons of water per year because they weren't having to water that prairie area as they were a lawn. Reduced 800 pounds of fertilizer per year and reduced 5 gallons of pesticides per year. So not only just keeping those costs down of fertilizers, water, but they also weren't having to manufacture those things, which again increases our greenhouse gases. Other benefits of native plants, they improve soil fertility. They are a great sink for that carbon in the soil. And then having those roots in the soil also improves stormwater infiltration. And so 1 hour of lawn mowing equals 20 miles of driving back and forth over the same soil. So that really compacts that soil down. So this area here in the picture where that water is standing, yeah, that would be a great place to put a rain garden with some of those native plants and increase that drainage there. And here's just a picture. I know many of you have seen this, but this really does show the depth of our native plants. And so here on the far left is turf grass, and that's mowed turf grass, so that tends to be pretty shallow rooted. But if you look at the rest of these plants, you know, they go down to, what is that deepest, 15 feet? You know, many of them are 3 to 4 feet deep. So that's great for adding moisture to our soil, letting that moisture soak in, pulling nutrients that have leached deeper down into the soil. It pulls it back up where more shallow rooted plants can get to it as well. So if you're growing native plants, choose plants that are adapted to the area. But in our changing climate, you know, you want plants that are adapted to a wide range of growing conditions, because here in Kansas, you know, we can get 110 and -10. Yeah, and we're getting those big rain events as well as extended droughts. So the more flexible those plants can be to a wide variety of growing conditions, the better that they'll do. Select plants with a local provenance, meaning plants that, you know, if you're collecting seed or plants that came from the local area, they're going to be best adapted to the local area. Again, select a variety of species for blooms throughout the growing season. So you have extended bloom time for all of those beneficial insects. Wait to plant them or to propagate them when it's a little bit cloudy and cooler. That gives them a better start. That, like I said, they do need a little bit of maintenance. Many of our plants will self deadhead, but if you can go out and deadhead themselves, then they're not putting those resources into producing seed and fruit, and they'll continue to grow. Plant more trees to absorb carbon dioxide, but also start looking at plants maybe that are a little more southern located. I'll often look at Oklahoma State at some of their plant lists to know what is a little more tolerant of more warmer temperatures that they get there. Another is to encourage biodiversity. So different rooting depths, different flowering times, intercrop vegetables and herbs with your ornamentals. So you can do some edible landscaping. If you look at the picture on the right, they've got squash and tomatoes right there in their flower garden right there on the curb. And, you know, many of our vegetable plants have some great ornamental qualities as well. Doing this decreases fertilizer needs because you're planting, you know, you can plant your legumes with your flowers. It increases the beneficial insects and decreases pests and diseases by having that diversity. Here's just a great picture of cabbage and some squash plants mixed right there in with the flowers. So for resilient vegetable gardens, plant heat sensitive crops um, where they'll get some afternoon shade, or look at some heat tolerant varieties. I know, tomatoes and such, anything that says Florida or the Heat Master, they tend to be a little more heat tolerant. When we do get some of those warmer temperatures, choose some varieties that mature quickly so you can plant them early and then they're not having to suffer and try to produce when we're getting those really hot temperatures. You look at some perennial vegetables, artichokes, asparagus, rhubarbs, fruit trees and bushes. Those again are ones that will do more for holding carbon into the soil. Sometimes our vine crops might need to be hand pollinated, especially when it's hot. Many of our vine crops tend to put out many more male flowers and earlier male flowers than they do the female flowers. So you may need to help those insects along and do some hand pollinating. The other is to look at parthenogenic cultivars, and these have been bred to fruit without the need for pollination. So many of these are what are growing in high tunnels, but the more hotter temperatures we get and the fewer insects and pollination that happens, some of these parthenogenic cultivars will produce more for us. Look at succession planting. So plant your radishes in 1 week and then wait another week to plant some more so that you have an extended crop. Again, use those cover crops. Crop rotation. So don't plant the same family of vegetables in the same spot year after year, because those tend to cause the pests to build up in that area. So rotate those crops. And again, interplant with those flowering plants and herbs, because the more diversity you have in your plantings, the more diversity you'll have with your insects. And again, limit the use of insecticides as much as possible. For lawns, if you can raise your mowing height to greater than 3 inches, the rooting depth correlates with the height of the grass blades. So the taller your grass blades are, the deeper your roots will be. If you can leave lawn clippings on the soil when you mow, that eliminates one fertilization a year, because that's adding that organic matter and those nutrients back to the soil. Again, use organic forms of nitrogen over synthetic forms, and avoid applying nitrogen in the springtime, because that's a great cause of brown patch diseases, is that spring fertilization. And the other is to replace lawns with no mow or less mowing plants. So buffalo grass and blue grama grass are native grasses for us here. They don't need to be mowed as much. They don't need the fertilizer inputs as well. Other people will add clover or other low-growing plants to their lawn. Or you can look at lawn alternatives, so walkable ground covers that can withstand impact and compaction. Permeable paving, so these are, in this picture here, are these grass pavers that you can plant the lawns or plant the grass in between, but they're strong enough that you could use as a driveway. Again, mulch, rather than trying to grow lawns under trees, or use ground covers instead of a lawn for difficult growing sites. Other things to do to make your garden resilient, limit the use of power tools. Again, those emissions from those power tools add to the greenhouse gases. So either use hand tools, or if you can use rechargeable or electric powered tools over gas powered. Reuse existing and salvaged materials. So, reuse your plastic pots, or look for plants that are grown in biodegradable containers over plastic ones, or make your own paper pots out of newspaper or other, out of your junk mail. Embrace a few weeds, and again, embrace those insects. Create microclimates within your garden so that some of those more tender plants have a place to grow. Save your own seeds. And again, be fire smart because we are starting to see more wildfires as well. Ways to reduce some of the heat risk are, grow plants along fences and walls, and those plants will kind of help keep temperatures down. Maximize ventilation and shading around your house. So grow trees that on the west and the south side to shade the house. Evergreens on the north side to help block some of the wind. Another is to use peat alternatives. Our peat bogs hold 30% of the Earth's soil carbon. And these are ancient bogs that are up in Canada, in the moist areas. Every time those are turned to harvest that peat, that carbon gets released into the atmosphere. So there's other alternatives, coconut coir, compost, rice hulls, or even just ground up wood and bark particles are a great way to recycle organic matter and not disturb those peat bogs. And the other is to grow your own food and eat your own food or share it at least. Wasted food causes 58% of methane emissions from municipal solid waste landfills. So either, make use of the food that you're growing, share it, or put it in the compost pile. Don't put it into the landfill. And then you also want to take care of the gardener. So when you're outside working early morning, cooler temperatures, make sure you're hydrated, wear sunscreen, and sun protective clothing. Make sure you're watching out, and knowing when you're getting heat stressed, and take frequent breaks. This is just a quick summary. So, create pollinator habitats, monitor, know what are pests, what are not, take care of the soil, take care of the water, be very judicious in your watering, and create wildlife habitats as well. So I think that's it. I think I've got a few minutes for questions. So
thank you, Pam. That was wonderful. The chat is just full of resources for everybody. Pam included a lot of resources. It'll be available on our website as well. I did save one question out from the Q&A. The person is curious about putting plants around a pond that only fills up with heavy rains. Do you have any suggestion for planting around the edge of a pond when we're getting these, gully washers, and then it's really dry, and then
right,
it's really dry?
Probably the first one I think of is switchgrass, and it's a native grass. It'll take wet soils and it'll take dry soils, but it's got that great network of roots that's good for holding soils too. So it'll help hold the sides of the pond when we do get those gully washers. But many of our other natives, goldenrod is one that can take wet soils or dry soils. Some of our oh, it just went out of my head. but yeah, look at those plants for rain garden plants. Those are the ones that can take the dry soils and the wet soils. Those are probably the ones to look at, especially if your pond fluctuates in those water levels.
Great, thank you, Pam. There's someone typing in for that last question in the Q&A, and I've also put a rain garden publication from K-State in the chat that will have more information on those particular plants. But at this time, I'll turn it back over to our host. Thank you very much, Pam. Lots of information and great resources.
Thank you guys all for those questions. I'm glad we were able to get through them, but we will, if you have more questions, be sure to link several articles related to this session on our website, and you can always follow up with your local extension agent to get more information and answers to your questions. Once again, thank you for joining our K-State Garden Hour series hosted by K-State Research and Extension. We're so glad that you could be here today to learn about climate resilient gardens, and thank you, Pam, for that awesome presentation. You can visit the K-State Garden Hour website to view our recorded Garden Hour archive or to make a tax-deductible donation to support the continuation of this webinar series. This session was recorded and will be posted on our website by tomorrow afternoon, along with all of the resources and articles. After this webinar ends today, you will receive a prompt to take an evaluation survey, and please fill this out. We would really appreciate your feedback, and we really do read it and go through all of it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at gardenhour@ksu.edu, and we'll send that email in the chat if you'd like to copy and paste it. Thank you again, and we hope that we see you again next month. Have a great week.